Viewers, you are watching the Policy Times, India's only media on public policy advocacy and activism. When we say public policy, international trade makes a huge impact for any nation because most of the countries are trying to promote export and import, and export and import has some legal implications. When two countries disagree on some international or mutually decided bilateral rules. To talk on that, we have with us Professor Markus Wagner, who is the Associate Professor at University of Wollongong, Australia, and he's also the Executive Vice President of Society of International Economic Law. So we have the World Trade Organization, which largely decides the international trade laws, international trade and economic laws. In the background, many countries sign bilateral and preferential trade agreements. But a lot of countries, as global trade is the current trend, there are a lot of trade disputes arising, which now countries are fighting to each other, who and which side to win. So to talk on that, I want to welcome Professor Wagner. Thank you so much for giving bites to us. The first question I want to know for our viewers, what is WTO and what has been its journey in terms of failures and success?
Sure. So thanks so much for the interview. The WTO is a member-driven organization that has roughly 150 members at this time, 160 members at this time, based in Geneva. It's a relatively small organization compared to the World Bank or the IMF. And has really three functions. Similar to governments worldwide, it has a legislative function, it has an executive function, and it has a dispute settlement function, right? Similar to what you see domestically. And you asked me about biggest failures, biggest successes. If you look at the history of the WTO, it's come into existence since 1995. Before that, it was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, much more limited in what it was doing and the coverage it had. The biggest failures, let me start there, is probably that since 1995, very little has happened in the area of in the legislative area, right? So no major new rules have come into place. There's a couple of agreements, trade facilitation agreement that has come into play. There's been some movement on intellectual property rights, but by and large, very little. Its biggest successes, on the other hand, was in the area of what we call dispute settlement, right? What you mentioned, right. Two countries have a dispute over the importation or exportation of products, under what circumstances that may happen. And in that area, the appellate body or the panels in the appellate body, a two-tier system, similar to what domestic courts look like, have, from my perspective, been a remarkable success.
Okay, wonderful. One big issue which would not only define the future architecture of the global trade, but also is impacting hugely in the current setup is the US-China trade war that we see. What role is WTO playing in that? What role can and should WTO play so that WTO, not only WTO survives, but also plays and continue play a constructive role in the global or international trade settlement?
So ideally, all the trade disputes that we have are taking place in front of the WTO, right?
Right, okay.
That's the way the system is designed. The way that I shy away from the term trade war, because for various reasons I think the term war is not apt, but the dispute between China and the US has taken place almost wholly outside of the WTO, in a bilateral relationship between the two countries.
Right.
To my mind, that's unfortunate because the way the system is designed, it is designed to have these disputes mediated and negotiations to take place within the World Trade Organization. The US has decided that it wants to have that to take place outside in a bilateral relationship because I think, it's my own my own take on this, is that it wants to be able to play the power that it thinks it has with respect to China on a bilateral relationship. So we see an active move away from the multilateral institution, that is the WTO, towards a more direct negotiation between two competing visions, really, of international trade law.
Professor, can you brief us about some nitty-gritties about the trade war and trade negotiation happening between these two countries, and how is it going to impact Europe, Asia, India, and most of the other countries?
Right, that's a fairly large area to cover. I don't know that we can predict very much. What we've seen initially was the concern that the U.S. administration had, certainly under President Trump, but also slightly beforehand, but much more accelerated under the Trump administration, that China, the trade deficit the U.S. has with China is too large. Right? So very much a focus on trade deficit. With respect to goods, that's actually true, but once you take services into account, that trade deficit is much, much lower.
Lesser.
Right? And so the idea is we need to decrease the input or the imports from China and increase the production in the US. That runs into a problem because the competitive advantage that China has is partially that it has lower wages and has other advantages that developing countries have by default. And so a lot of manufacturing had gone outside of the US. And then the question is, how do you structurally how do you restructure the US economy in order to accommodate that? I'm not an economist, but what economists tell us is that's hardly possible, right? So that you shift your own economy towards a more service-based industry or other areas in which you have an advantage.
Right.
So the Trump administration, in Obama administration before it, had put various measures in place with respect to, say, steel and aluminum on China, because what it said, and probably rightly said, was that Chinese manufacturers were dumping products, right? So selling below what the normal price for a product would be in a foreign market. So that's called dumping. And there, I think, with respect to subsidies, that I think your viewers are familiar with, what subsidies are, and dumping, the U.S. has a point, right? That the Chinese model of how its economy is being run is probably not as compatible as with WTO rules as we previously thought.
I see.
And so that's where the dispute started. And now the question, follow-up question you had was, how does that impact other countries around, outside of the US and China? So what you saw then was that compounded the problem, has less to do with China initially, was that the US invoked what it said, on national security grounds, we need to put tariffs on steel and aluminum from other countries. If you look at the statistics, the origin of that steel and aluminum were all friendly countries and allies. Right? Okay. China ranked very low because of the anti-dumping duties that I mentioned. The exports from China to the US for steel and aluminum were relatively low to begin with. And so countries in the European Union, Canada, Mexico, very close allies, were actually hit by these tariffs. And then they were scaled back. Even the Pentagon, the United States Defense Department, said that there's no problem with respect to national security, right, in those discussions. Nevertheless, those measures were put in place and then subsequently rolled back. But they're still hovering around and introducing a great amount of uncertainty with respect to the trade relations between, say, the European Union, Brazil, lots of other countries, and the US. Right? And so we're at an unfortunate moment where countries are less able to rely on an existing body of rules that they can say with some certainty will govern the relations with other countries. So that's I think the situation we're finding ourselves in. And the European Union, you asked that, is sort of trying to play both sides, isn't quite sure in which direction it's heading, because
because of the unpredictability.
Well, not because it's trying to determine potentially which side will win, or which side will give it the most advantages over time. I think ultimately what you see there is less a dispute over particular products, but rather a dispute certainly driven from the US side, but also from the Chinese side, over what economic model actually wins out, right? A more state-centered model that that China is driving, or
that will be very interesting to see, in fact.
Or
a capitalist model, or
a capitalist model with a lot of modifications. If you look at it, some of the examples in the Trump administration provided huge amounts of subsidies, essentially, to companies that were then praised to remain in the U.S., but the amount of money that was being put into these companies from the state side make it less a capitalist decision.
Final question I want to ask you is that there are a lot of... So RCEP was the last mega regional trading blocks agreement which has been signed recently. Unfortunately, India couldn't be part of that. India didn't be part of that. Now, there are a lot of such preferential trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, mega regional trade agreements happening across the world. Indian business community, so far, the picture is dicey how much they have been benefiting from such agreements. How are these bilateral, preferential, free trade agreements are coexisting in such complex environment, trade environment now?
So the first thing I'll say is, you use the term free trade agreement. I don't use that term personally, because there's nothing like free trade.
Free.
It's liberalized trade or liberal trade, but there's nothing free, right? Because you will have regulations that countries will put up for prudent reasons. That's why there's no such thing as free trade. Let me just say that first. There is, however, a large number of, and you mentioned pretty much all the words that people use, trade agreements, regional trade agreements, mega regional trade agreements, and so forth, right? And so, number one, the relationship between, say, the WTO and these agreements is one thing that's interesting to talk about. And the other thing is, to what extent should countries, say, like India, open up towards these agreements or not? Right? And the question is always whether it's WTO on the global level or whether it's regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, whatever we want to call these trading blocks, is who wins and who loses in those arrangements, right? And the economic orthodox sort of theory says products should be produced in the place where they are most efficiently produced, right?
Absolutely.
And the question is to what extent and how quickly a country like India or other developing countries should open up their markets to foreign competition. Because it could very well destroy a large number of positions in the economy, and that has repercussions for politicians, right? And so it's a question, to my mind, not so much of whether to open up or not. I think opening up in the long run will help the larger majority of consumers, but it also needs to be ameliorated, because otherwise you end up with lots of people without jobs, and therefore who may end up in poverty. So it's a very...
And a bit of disruption.
A lot of disruption potentially, right? And so if you think about the trade war, as you would call it, between China and the US administration plays exactly on that same issue, right? All this manufacturing positions that have moved out of the United States have led to a lot of disruption. So it's in some ways similar, and so the question is, how do you cushion that, right? What kind of welfare policies, distributional policies can you put in place in order to soften the blow for those who may be out of a job, right? You can play this across a whole range of sectors. You can also play this across, say, the coal sector. If you think, if you understand that climate change is a real thing, you introduced me as being from Australia. Climate change is very real. There's fires all around where I live. Then the question is, how do you, for example, provide incentives to no longer extract coal, and what do you do with the miners who extract that coal? What kind of positions and what kind of arrangements do you give for them in order to learn another trade or to transition them into other positions? And that's, I think, the real problem. That's been recognized, funnily enough, by the World Bank, by the IMF, and the WTO in a report as of a few years ago, which is something that we would never have considered probably 5 or 10 years ago.
Right, absolutely. We had Professor Markus Wagner, all the way from Australia, who is on a 4-week trip to India, giving us some account accounts on what is happening, the trade war between US and China, and it's a clear picture. The picture is clear. It is who wins the game or who wins the race. So America winning the capitalism side, China winning the state-sponsored communism or socialism or capitalism side. So thank you. Keep watching the Policy Times.